Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I'm your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a very special returning guest with us, Tyler Gilreath, to talk about his new book, Gate of the Gods. Welcome back to the show, Tyler. How are you doing?
Josh, it is so good to be back on your program. I'm doing well. God is good. We are blessed. And I'm looking forward to talking about a topic that is very important to a lot of people, including you and me, and that is the book of Revelation. So it's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been my favorite book of the Bible, which is it's weird to say favorite book of the Bible because the whole Bible should be your favorite book of the Bible. But
Right.
It's been one that I've been most fascinated by. Maybe is a better way to say it. Since I was in single digits in my age, since I could learn how to read, I've been trying to figure out what's going on, and I've always loved
Right.
the imagery and the mystery behind it. And it's cool because now I now have children of my own that age, and they're following in my footsteps. They love it too. So I'm excited to get into this. In your introduction, and this was a big key for me to understanding Revelation. In your introduction, you explain how the Old Testament can be found in the book of Revelation. And the way that I understand it, Revelation sort of like presumes that you already know the Old Testament to be able to understand what's happening. And I think that might be a big reason why so many people end up getting kind of confused about it or not understanding what's going on. Do you find the same thing to be true? And how do you see the Old Testament in Revelation?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. That is the blueprints to the book of Revelation. And look, I've been in church ministry for 15 years. I pretty much ran from the book of Revelation for a long time. Not necessarily my private study, but in public, because you know I didn't feel like I had the right foundation going into it. Which is, you got to know several things. One, you need to have a pretty good handle on the supernatural worldview of the Bible. What is going on in Scripture with all these various beings and heavenly hosts? And so, after I wrote my first book, Gospel Over Gods, I was motivated to dig deeper, and so I did. And I was surprised to learn that the Book of Revelation is a conglomerate of uh, Old Testament themes and verses and phrases. And I like to use this illustration. It's kind of like John was making a smoothie, an apocalyptic smoothie, and he threw randomness, but it was strategic, into the blender and hit the start button. And what came out was this masterpiece of theology. It really is. It is. I didn't appreciate the depth, the intricacies, the detail to the beautiful prophetic tapestry until I again uncovered for myself the blueprints to the book. And you hit the nail on the head. It is understanding that the book of Revelation is summarizing, is bringing a conclusion to the story of the Bible. And to do so, we're going to nod the hat, we're going to nod the head to all the literary theology that came before. And so that's what he does, especially with the Hebrew prophets. Um, Most Christians I think in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews is probably, the book that utilizes the Old Testament, the most. And Revelation kind of blows it out of the water. Not that they're competing, but it does. It's unbelievable. And I simply didn't have enough room in the book to, articulate and list, everywhere where John uses the Old Testament. But I try to highlight that throughout the book because that is the key to unraveling the mystery.
Absolutely, and I totally agree. What are some of your favorite examples of it? If you could give us a couple examples of where it's prominently, you can see how this place in Revelation really can't be understood until you learn this place in the Old Testament, and then it just brings it alive. What were a couple that
Sure.
really opened it up for you?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the way that Jesus gets described. Okay. Our eyes like flame of fire. We have this, white hair. We're wearing, these garments, all these things. And the reason is that Revelation is very much interested in what scholars call higher Christology. The idea that we're going to elevate Jesus to the same position as Yahweh. Okay, and that's important. John hadn't seen Jesus in decades. Okay, and so he's seeing him for the first time in his returned God state, if you will. Where he, for a little while, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels, right, to suffer and all these things. But then he returned back to the Father, and Jesus wanted his disciples to see the glory that he once had, there in his natural environment, if you will. And so the way Jesus gets described is the same way Yahweh gets described throughout the Old Testament. By the sound of his voice, the sound of many waters, and all these descriptions. He's the true one. He's the the holy one. All these descriptive terms of Jesus that are just nicely sprinkled in the smoothie all the way through the book. They actually point back and link to the way that Yahweh gets described, and that's important because I think some Christians. I continue to be surprised. I recently came across an individual that had been a Christian for probably 50, 60 years. And they were against the idea that Jesus was a part of creation, that was God, not Jesus, And that's probably how at least some people view Jesus. They may say, okay, he was a part of creation, but they may view him as like a second tier, like lower than God. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Almost like, God is Hank Aaron and Jesus is the Bat Boy kind of thing, but maybe not that big gap. But one thing Revelation dismisses is that notion. I mean, it solidifies the fact that Jesus is God. Okay, Jesus is Yahweh. So we are going to describe him in all those ways. If you remember, even there was a problem in heaven in the book of Revelation. No one could open the scroll and the seals and read the contents thereof. And the only one worthy was the Lamb of God. Again, so that there's even times where, Revelation puts Jesus kind of like on the top of the mountain, and so that was one of the big takeaways for me, that Jesus is God in every way, and we've known that, but the way Revelation describes it and the links to which John goes to make sure his readers understand that is very, very important. Another example I'll give you.
Yeah.
The primary issue in the 7 churches of Asia Minor was, and I reveal this in the book, it was idolatry. Okay. Now you kind of get, explicit statements in a couple places, but by and large, most people don't really pick up on that. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the reason we know that is because of the things Jesus says to the 7 churches. For example, he echoes back to Balaam, and he says there are those of Balaam, or the Nicolaitans, that are there in the church. Well, who was Balaam? What did Balaam do? Well, Balaam was a pagan prophet that tried to lead God's people into idolatry.
Yeah.
And so it's that context that was going on in the Old Testament is now going on in that church. Jezebel is among one of the congregations, one of the churches. Same thing with her. Tried to lead people into sexual promiscuity that was associated with idolatry. Okay, so you have all these things sprinkled in that we are left in the dark, scratching our head, wondering what is that about if we don't understand the Old Testament. I'll give you one more, and then maybe we'll move on to something else. But
sure.
Another puzzling piece to the book of Revelation for a lot of people is this idea that there were angels among the churches.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask that next anyway, because there have been this debate as to the identity of the angels in the 7 churches. Are they mortal messengers, like the leaders or pastors of the churches, or are they actual angels? So, yeah. What are your thoughts?
So it's funny. A lot of people say, all the angels in the book of Revelation are supernatural, except for in the beginning of the book, and those are just men. Well, that's a red flag. The context of parsing the language, Josh, is what you and I know as the Deuteronomy 32 worldview.
Yep.
And for your listeners that may be foggy on that, essentially, it was the Tower of Babel scene in the second telling of the story. Moses gives some extra details that are not in the Genesis 10 or 11 section of Genesis. And he says, when the Most High divided the nations, he divided them according to the number of the sons of God. Septuagint says they're angels. And so the nations were following spirits. And throughout the narrative, there's this one angel called Michael. He was the Prince of Israel. And so what is the church? The church is called Israel or spiritual Israel, throughout the Bible and prophecy and in the book of Revelation. You have them in the book of James. They're called the 12 tribes, all these things. And so it's consistent with the Old Testament concept that, angels are among people, okay, good and bad angels. And so the church being spiritual Israel, it makes sense. There are angels looking out for God's elect people, just like they were in the Old Testament.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's such a fascinating topic to think about it that way, because our culture today within Christianity is to downplay a lot of these supernatural elements that we see all throughout the Bible. Something else that I found really interesting, and I like how you explain it in the book, is that as much as we can see the Old Testament in Revelation, we can also see Jesus in the Old Testament. And I'd love for you to get into that. What are a few of your favorite examples of Jesus showing up prior to the Gospels?
That's also kind of a revolutionary thought that Jesus could be present on planet Earth, in the Old Testament. There are some, maybe mysteries we'll never fully understand, or maybe we will. Some people associate Jesus with Melchizedek for, the way Melchizedek gets described, without father, without mother, without genealogy, all these things. I really don't get into that in the book. But I note a verse in the book of Jude that places Jesus aiding Israel in their Exodus
Yes.
account. And I kind of hypothesize and dig into that a little bit and say, could this be true? And it is true. In the Old Testament, there are many angels, but there was one called the angel of Yahweh. An angel is just a generic term, malak or malakim. It means messenger.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's more
so
like a job title rather than a
that's
title of a
it.
species or something.
Exactly. It's a job description. Okay.
Mhm.
One thing we're not saying is Jesus was ontologically an angel or
Right.
among the ranks of angels. Okay. He was a part of creation. He wasn't a created being. But he did play that role in the Old Testament. And I go into the book and make a case why Jesus is the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, throughout the Old Testament story. And so if that's the case, imagine Jesus guiding Israel through much of the muck and the destruction and the wars that they experienced out on their way out of Egypt. It would really just increase the storyline and connect to Jesus in the New Testament. And so the reason I bring that up in Gate of the Gods is because there is a section in Revelation that describes this mighty angel. And again, the way that angel gets described in that chapter in the book of Revelation is with terminology associated with Yahweh in the Old Testament. So again, this is all a very important discussion. And so again, why would that be the case? Well, again, it's called angelomorphic Christology. It's associating Jesus with a divine messenger figure. And that's important in the book of Revelation because John at every turn is looking for opportunities to lift Jesus up to the churches in his proper place. And so we're going to compare him to, we're going to connect him to Yahweh and the Son of Man, and we're going to connect him to the angel of Yahweh. And, any way we can get it through their skulls that Jesus is that guy. He is the Lord. He is God, ruler of heaven and earth, who has all authority and all power. John takes every opportunity to tell his audience that with this repository of Old Testament language.
And it's amazing to think about how present Jesus is all throughout the Bible. One strange account that a lot of people have misinterpreted, unfortunately, is that we find brief mention of Jesus traveling to the underworld after his death, and there's this weird teaching going around that says that like he suffered for us in hell, and that's not the case at all. What is Jesus's role when it comes to the underworld?
So Revelation says that very briefly that he took the keys of death and Hades. Okay, these are two underworld, netherworld power players who would undoubtedly have this set of cosmic keys. And that's important because again, they're kind of the ones that lord over, their flock or their dark flock that they have gathered to themselves. And I talk about that a little bit in my book. This idea of death personified goes back to different cultures, even the Hebrew culture, where this dark, malevolent figure called Maveth would rule and reign in the underworld. And there's even accounts, and I talk about this in Gate of the Gods, where Israel makes a covenant with Maveth, and Yahweh continually scolds them for such agreements. And so Jesus just kind of walks into the underworld, the way the Bible describes it, and he says, I want the keys of the car. I'm busting out of here in a couple of days, and you're still going to be left. And interestingly enough, that ties to what Peter said about Jesus, that Jesus preached to the spirits in prison. And a lot of people say, "Oh, that's just dead humans. They're spirits in prison." But they're overlooking the fact that that's a phrase that comes from the book of Enoch. And Enoch says, "No, they're not humans. These are the Watchers who were imprisoned for their Genesis 6 rebellion." Okay, and so whether it's John in Revelation talking about Jesus taking the keys of death and Hades, or Maveth, these malevolent, dark netherworld deities, or whether it's Jesus proclaiming to the Watchers that he's leaving and they're staying, again, Jesus is dominant. Okay, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. And so that's incredibly important because Jesus is asking us to follow him, not just in the way we live our life, and, our example and what we do, but he's asking us to follow him pretty much into death and resurrection. And so the only hope we have to be raised incorruptible is the fact that Jesus was victorious over death and Hades, the Watchers, and the whole band. And, without that triumphant victory and exodus from the underworld, Paul said, without the resurrection, we are of most men most miserable. We're still in our sins. We like to talk about the cross, and rightly so. The cross is a pivotal event where Jesus crushed the head of the snake and the gods of Bashan, the bulls of Bashan, Psalm 22. But without the resurrection, you see, you have a half-cooked pie. The resurrection was the linchpin that led to the devil's defeat. So Revelation dips into that as well as Peter and other places. But I'm glad you brought that up because that's so important. And again, John hadn't seen Jesus in decades, and so it's we haven't talked to each other in decades. Let's catch up a little bit and let me tell you all the things I've been up to. And
Yeah, definitely.
that was one of them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And now that Jesus has ascended to heaven, what is his role in heaven now, and what will it be in the future, like at Armageddon, for example? And are these roles distinct, or are they the same?
Well, Jesus is undoubtedly doing a lot of things. He's undoubtedly heading up the council, the council meetings, the divine council, where various spirits contribute, make contributions and motions to vacate leaders or to interfere with, uh, extreme plans on the earth. And so, undoubtedly, Jesus is involved with that. Jesus is described as a high priest. That's a theme in the book of Revelation. Also, the angels are functioning as a priest, priestly functions with the prayers and whatnot, and Jesus is seen as this high priestly figure. So, um, the atonement piece is there, and then you also mentioned the idea of, well, the atonement piece, the judicial piece, and then you also mentioned the idea of Armageddon, which is the ruler, the war piece that is a very central theme to the book of Revelation. And I think most people that have studied Revelation on a pretty shallow level, they get that. That's an obvious takeaway. Jesus gets described as riding on a white horse, because that symbolizes victory, that symbolizes salvation, um, and so Armageddon is a big event in the book of Revelation. And one thing I talk about, Josh, is that uh, there's not really one Armageddon passage. There's actually three, and that should not surprise us because um, there are cycles in Revelation. There appears to be cycles. Some of the things in Revelation um, may appear chronological, linearly, and then they'll kind of circle back again and talk about the same event or from a different camera angle, a different lens, or something like that. And that's what makes Revelation so interesting, trying to unravel this mystery. But that's what it does with Armageddon. Armageddon is discussed, from three camera angles, and Jesus is at the center of all of them. And one thing we would expect to see in the Book of Revelation is maybe all of the gory details of the slain demonic army and in the battle, but it's kind of like it goes out with a whimper. It's kind of it's kind of like um, you tried, but we're going to stop you before you really can make this a long war, which is very different than the way the Battle of Armageddon gets described in the War Scroll,
Right.
in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's one thing I talk about in Gate of the Gods is Armageddon is not a New Testament concept originally. It actually is an old concept that goes back to Ezekiel, I believe 38 and 39, and so when John's readers are reading about the Battle of Armageddon, they already have this kind of backdrop in their mind, and part of that backdrop I mentioned was ideas that get fleshed out in the War Scroll, where I believe in the War Scroll there are maybe 7 rounds, and it's like tied 3-3, and Jesus says, "Okay, enough is enough," or the Sons of Light say, "Enough is enough" in the War Scroll, and they just kind of knock out the enemy in the 7th round, and it's all over. But in the Book of Revelation, it's not really described that way. It's again, not to say that there won't be a back and forth, or it just, the details aren't really given as far as the amount of time, or is it going to be 2-2? How many rounds are there? That kind of concept that we're used to with the boxing and that kind of thing. It's just kind of a soft whimper. Again, I think it's that way in the book of Revelation to, again, just reemphasize how powerful Jesus is. On the rider on the white horse leading the sons of light. I mean, Jesus is just heads and shoulders above all of them. We like in sports, we like to compare athletes. I don't know if you are up on sports or not, Josh, or like basketball, but it seems like they're always comparing Michael Jordan and LeBron James, right? Who's the GOAT? Who's the greatest of all time? And here's why. There's nobody you can compare Jesus to. I
Right.
mean, there's nobody on the other team that is even close. And that's what John wants his readers to come away with is that, hey, have faith, keep your faith till the end. Don't give up. Sure, it may be a bumpy ride, but when it really counts, it's not even going to be close, And so that's a big takeaway. Again, the Battle of Armageddon, which takes place not at Megiddo, but the Mount of Assembly, Jerusalem. I don't think I really get into this in the book, but essentially it's historically been described as the battle at Megiddo. And Armageddon is a Hebrew word originally, Har-Moged. And the reason why, it has been translated Megiddo is because in Hebrew there's essentially a couple of G sounds, Gimel and Gayan, and they usually run with one of them, which would translate Mount Megiddo. Har means mountain, Mount Megiddo. But there's this other, G that if it's that one, it would be, Mount of Assembly, mm-hmm. which is Jerusalem. And there is a mountain there that, that is the cosmic capital. Mm-hmm. So it's a fascinating topic. And I get into, again, Armageddon, looking at it from several different lenses throughout the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and that location, because when I first heard that, I think I first heard it from Derek Gilbert like a few years ago, and when he explained it, just like when you explained it, it makes sense. It makes more sense that it would be Jerusalem there, and it fits together with everything. Something else that a lot of people get mixed up too is what Babylon actually is, and yeah. I think you lay a great case for this in the book. How do you define Babylon as mentioned in Revelation? What do you do with the whole mystery Babylon thing?
Yeah. It's interesting. Again, historically, a lot of people see Rome in the book of Revelation, and I'm not knocking that. I think Rome was a modern day Babylon. Okay, they just were. But Rome was a temporary puppet, and there were spiritual entities pulling the strings. Okay, that go back to the Tower of Babel, right? And so the case I make in the book is that, hey, if you want to learn about Rome, read these other books. I'm not knocking it. But let's talk about the real engine of chaos, the old engine of chaos that has been running the nations, leading them astray for a couple thousand years. Let's talk about them and let's focus on them. And so that's what I do in the book. I state that Babylon is inseparable from the Babel event. Without the Babel event, you don't have the engine of chaos. And so it's so important to understand, and I kind of track, with the audience, with the readers, how you get historically from Babel to Babylon and why it matters. And so who is Babylon, Mystery Babylon? It's the gods of the Tower of Babel. And that's important because those guys have to be defeated. Okay, they got to be defeated. The Watchers are currently under gloomy chains of darkness. But those guys are causing chaos everywhere, and they have to be defeated. So Revelation is going to answer that. How are we going to bring down Babylon? the engine of chaos in the book of Revelation, which has supernatural drivers. And the way Babylon gets defeated is on several fronts. Not just literally defeated, but literarily defeated. Okay? Because at the heart of Babylon are sacred texts, writings, and beliefs. And so scholars like to call this polemic theology. It is poking the eye at previously written religious beliefs, creation stories, religious service. And so John and Jesus, they're going to dismantle Babylon from the very foundation of what made it Babylon. And that is, in the book of Revelation, John's going to dip into the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story that describes how Marduk became king of the gods at Babylon by defeating a chaotic sea serpent named Tiamat. That is a big deal in the book of Revelation. But also, Babylonian astrology is a big deal in the book of Revelation. Babylon had a lot of tablets and documents, if you will, on how to interpret the stars. In fact, I would argue that was where it all began, as far as cataloging. When we see this in the sky, this is what this means. And so essentially, there was some tablets that we found called Enuma Anu Enlil. And it was 70 tablets, which is very suspicious in that there were at least 70 nations, 70 gods of the nations. But there were 70 tablets that contained 7,000 scenarios. 7,000. And so Babylonian divination manual, that became ubiquitous, that lasted well beyond Babylon into the 4th century. So, John is going to describe at least a couple chapters what's going on Earth by what's going on in the stars. And we don't really understand that and process that unless we have some kind of manual to say, well, what does all this mean? And when you filter it through the manual, guess what happens? It reveals the identity of the 4 horsemen, the 4 demonic horsemen, which are very, very mysterious, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to ask you about that for sure. But before I do, where can people, and I got more questions for you too, but before we get to those, where can people find you online and pick up your books?
Well, you can probably get it on Amazon, probably on the Skywatch TV store, I'm sure. I'm on social media, on Facebook at the moment, so feel free to shoot me a friend's request. I'll be glad to connect with you. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, I suggest everybody do that. All right, we do have a lot more to talk about with Tyler. The very next thing after this that I'm going to ask him is to talk about the identity of 4 horsemen, because I'm extremely interested in that. I know many of you are out there as well. But in order to get the rest of this conversation, head on over to dailyrenegade.com and get a membership today. Daily Renegade was created to fight back against social media censorship of our videos and provides a place for us all to watch what we want, say what we want, and have a great fellowship together discussing topics like this that you probably will never hear about in church. Unless you go to Tyler's church, then you probably hear about this all the time, which is great. So get this full interview and more by heading over to dailyrenegade.com, which is linked in the description below, and get a membership, which is only $10 a month or $100 a year. If you can do it, I suggest getting the $100 a year because it is technically cheaper for you in the long run. Essentially, you get 2 months for free. Our video page works a lot like YouTube, and our community page works a lot like Facebook. So it's just just without the censorship. Best of both worlds without the censorship. So if you are viewing this on the Daily Renegade website, you don't have to do anything. Just hold on the line and we'll get back into our conversation with Tyler Gilreath. For everyone viewing for free on YouTube and Rumble, thank you so much. And until next time, take care and God bless.